being very forward-thinking and on the cutting edge of police work and using data. With that said, if I had to be honest, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, we're probably around a 2, maybe 2.5. And I say that because I don't think we're any different from any other place. You know, we pride ourselves on being very data-driven and evidence-based, but there's so much more that we can do. And everything from just how we use data, how we process it, but even the basic things as how we collect it. Now, we recently did a administrative operations audit of all of public safety, and one of the big challenges that we had was, you know, our data systems simply weren't working. We didn't have the data in order to make informed decisions. And bear in mind, this comes from a police department that's widely recognized as being very forward-thinking and data-driven. So there is a lot of room to grow, not just in Providence, but my sense is that every police department throughout the country can do a lot better.
I'm not taking a 2. My goodness, that's a tough grader right there, Mayor. I think Cincinnati is probably a 7 or an 8, looking for rooms for improvement. But you know, the murder of George Floyd and so many of these national tragedies and crises. Unfortunately, my city of Cincinnati experienced those in a really acute way over 20 years ago. And the hard work of bringing the FOP, the community, the city administrations, and the politicians to the table, roll up our sleeves and get something done, a foundation by which we built a modern policing infrastructure, we experienced a couple of decades ago. And what came out of that really difficult work was the collaborative agreement. Our efforts, our model to prioritize problem-solving oriented policing. That was data-driven, that was evidence-based, and the infrastructure for creating that, the foundation for creating that, is now, as I mentioned, several years old. And so we've learned from our mistakes, and it's more of a mature model. One of the pillars of that collaborative agreement is something called the Citizen Complaint Authority. A lot of cities right now are dealing with civilian review boards. Ours, again, is several years old. Not only is it a good tool for transparency and accountability with our police force, but it's also a data-driven reform mechanism as well, because as the authority sees trends in complaints and in contexts and scenarios where complaints happen, they make policy recommendations to the politicians and the administration officials in the police department to make reforms.
Wow. So I would give St. Louis about a 5 or 6 because data-driven policing strategies is a new muscle for us and has been brought to the forefront by my administration. I've only been mayor for about 1 year and 5 months, but who's counting? We use data-driven policing strategies in our deployment. We've also partnered with the Center for Policing Equity to let us know where our pain points are, where our deployment strategies are effective, and also how we're doing as we make police stops. And of course, that data told us that you're 2 to 3 more times likely to be stopped and charged if you are African American in the city of St. Louis versus if you're a white person. But the other thing that we've used data for, and our friends at MasterCard have helped us with this, is evaluating new deployment strategies. So we started a Cops and Clinicians program that sends out an officer with a licensed clinical social worker or other behavioral health provider, and we've asked MasterCard to help us evaluate the effectiveness of that, and we found that it saved thousands of hours of time from our first responders as well as millions of dollars. So we know these things work, and now we have the data to show that they're working.
So, John, before you answer, because I want you to be our cleanup hitter, Wendy, Mayor Jones just used the word evaluation, and that is chiefly what you are responsible for. So can you talk to us about, from your position, how you are evaluating processes, procedures within the NYPD to make sure they are equitable?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first I want to really give a shout out to Smart City, because I have been to many equity conferences around the nation, and this is really one of the best. The fact that we get to sit here and have intelligent conversations about how equity plays a core role in municipalities, and we're seeing people who are pushing this really is a round of applause for all of you, so thank you. You know, the concept of equity and inclusion, everyone's been saying, really has been quite a buzzword. But I think there's some critical aspects that we're seeing in New York City that maybe other cities are maybe doing better, but also can learn from as well. I've been now recently appointed about 4 months, so I can tell you that I came in and it's a big job. One of the first things that we're looking at is that we know representation matters. That when people leave their homes, they have to see that the people that protect them look like them, understand their culture, can tell the difference between a noise complaint and people just talking, right? These are things that are critical in the quality of life in different neighborhoods. And so what we did, especially with recruitment, is that we looked at how women are represented in our police force. We're 56,000 people. We're larger than most cities across the nation. And 19% of the women in uniform now are women. Is that a large number? If you compare it to other cities, yes. If you're New York City with 8 million people, you will say we have a long way to go. So we're using data to track representation, not just at the level of race, gender, but we're also looking at ranks. We want to know that women are represented at the lieutenant level, at the police officer level, that we have inspectors, that we have chiefs. One of the most recent things that we're doing is my particular office, we have oversight of how commanding officers are chosen around the whole city of New York. So I'm looking at how do we answer the question of, is this commanding officer representative of that particular community? We know that when there is a large issue in one particular neighborhood, and I'm sure mayors, you've all seen this in your particular communities, we go to the commanding officer. So we're using data to track whether our commanding officers are reflective of those specific communities. And I can tell you, just since Mayor Adams came in post his administration, we are seeing a higher number of African Americans, of Latinos, of Asians, of women who are now represented in the higher ranks, specifically in those areas.
So John, I want to turn to you, as I said, our cleanup hitter. From your private sector perspective, what do you look at what cities are doing as pertains to data and policing and how they're making sure that's ushering equitable outcomes? How do you think they're doing? And what could they be doing better?
Yeah, I think it's new. The whole data, bringing data to the equation for cities is new. In kind of the commercial sector, we always see so much data being available, and I think over time we're seeing more and more data become available within cities because of the open data environment that's actually happening. And the way in which we're going about policing as well allows us to get a lot more data. With the whole advent of body cameras, it allows us to get correct data of actually what is happening, and things actually can't be manipulated because you can actually review footage so that the data is properly put into the system when we're looking at various different police reporting and whatnot. So we're really excited because we believe we're at a precipice. We've seen this before in industry where there's this whole kind of data tsunami that's actually happening. And within government, we're actually starting to see that with more and more agencies sharing data with an open data environment at the state, the federal, and the county level. And these barriers being removed to actually leverage data to inform decisions has been something that's been real exciting for us to see. That being said, we're still early days, and we have a tremendous opportunity to continue moving forward in this particular realm.
You know, I'm struck by the different ways you all talked about data. You talked about it within the police force. Mayors, you talked about it in terms of community outcomes. John, you also just talked about body cams and the way police agencies use data themselves, and we're only at the tip of this iceberg. Body cams, license plate readers, we don't know what the future holds with facial recognition, other predictive policing models. So, and I see Mayor Elorza knows where I'm going. I want to talk about it from within police usage. How do you make sure that use is appropriate and doesn't exacerbate or reinforce existing inequities? Mayor Elorza, you are ready.
Well, 2 points that I wanted to make. I wanted to, so John from MasterCard, I think you're exactly right. I do believe that we are still just scratching the surface of how data can and should be used in policing. So for example, I don't think there's a reliable way to measure what % of interactions with our police officers are positive ones. I don't know of any city that has something like that, and there are ways that we can more and more measure even those intangibles that might have been out of reach without the use of technology. Also, when we evaluate police officers, to what extent is data used to evaluate our commanding officers and down the line? They say that you measure what matters, but as of right now, we're not measuring what we truly claim matters. So I still think we're just scratching the surface with fertile ground ahead of us. But I do want to give a concrete example of how we've been able to successfully use data to address a void, once it was presented to us. So we did this deep dive data audit, operations audit in our police department, and it turns out that by far the #1 reason why people were getting arrested in our city was driving with a suspended license. So only like 2% of police calls actually come in for Part 1 crimes. So people are getting arrested for suspended licenses. So this triggered a question, well, why do people have suspended licenses? So we did a deeper dive into the data, and it revealed that by far the #1 reason people have suspended licenses are failures to pay fines and fees, and they accumulate over time. So literally in Providence, and I suspect throughout the country, we're literally arresting people for being poor. So with the use of American Rescue Plan dollars, we launched a license restoration program. As we dove into that work, we realized that that navigating that system, that process, it's cumbersome, really complicated, out of most people's reach. And so this is a way where, once you do the deep dive into the data and you make a commitment to it, it opens your eyes to challenges that you might not have seen before, and it lends itself to creative solutions.
In Cincinnati, we're trying to cultivate a culture of innovation, and that is true for our public services, for our trash and snow removal, and also for public safety. No one is above analysis and feedback, innovation, and getting better. And so we were very eyes wide open about the fact that our 911 response was just not an effective use of our resources and wasn't an effective strategy for dealing with the issues that we're seeing every day. Oftentimes our police officers were being called to one specific address in our city. Over a 6-month period, they were called to this one address 1,200 times. In addition, they were often being used as a taxi cab service. So the current status quo for 911 was to call park enforcement, fire, or police. And if it didn't fit any of those 3 categories, you just sent the police, which is preventing them from their priority, which is preventing and prosecuting violent crime. And so we jumped right over the co-response model of a medical professional going with a police officer, and now we have a pilot program in a specific geographic area in a specific time where if you call 911 for homelessness or addiction issues or other mental health issues, we send mental health professionals that are unarmed. It's a pilot program because we are studying the data that we're getting back. What time of the day are these calls mostly coming in from? What are the issues that they're facing? What are the safety concerns? And the early data, which is really exciting, is that #1, none of our emergency responders have called the police because of fear of safety, which is exciting. And #2, in just a 2-month period, we have saved over 150 hours of police time, which is also incredibly helpful, particularly given how small our recruit classes have been and our historic amount of retirements. So that's a program we're putting in place right now, a program that we're looking to put in place. And I agree with the mayor. The data that we have right now is not helping us do our job more effectively. We need more data and we need better data. The criminal justice system right now in all parts of the country is a black box. We do not really understand why people are being charged, what they're charged. We don't understand why they're being sentenced, what they're sentenced, why their bond is being placed at the level that it's being placed. So what we're working together with our judges and our prosecutor's office and our police, we're putting together a data set where from arrest until appeal, we're trying to put all that data into one portal so we can analyze it. And once we have a better understanding where the outages are and the discrimination is, we can fashion solutions that are surgical.
Wendy, can I ask you, because Mayor Elorza used the word measure that matters, and I want to know from your perspective in your role, how you determine what matters and how you are implementing more effective evaluatory methods.
No, it's an amazing question. I think most of us, when we think of the police department, we think of a different narrative, right? We think of a narrative of what we saw growing up. And so that's a narrative that we're trying to change in New York City. And then how do we do that? One of the first things we did coming in within this new administration is that we did do assessment of our own uniform and civilian. And we asked them questions around what will make you stay? And as you can imagine, for the women on the panel, there were many recommendations. And what did we find? That we needed to make sure that women in NYPD felt that it was a safe place to work, that it was an inclusive environment, and that it was free from discrimination. So we partnered with, many of you know the Police Collaborative, which made multiple recommendations. That's a way that you use data to really look at policy, and we took that seriously. Actually, on Monday, before I got here, we just launched the first Women's Institute at NYPD. It is the first 9-month program for women in NYPD. It is the first time we have women of multiple rankings, everything from lieutenants to inspectors to chiefs. We are partnering them with mentors. We started the Mentorship Institute. The Mentorship Institute is only going to focus on marginalized communities, because we know in New York, even though 64% of our workforce in NYPD is women and people of color, which is officially now, I think, the most, sorry mayors, we're the most diverse in the nation. Happy to talk afterwards on how to get that done. Even though we know that is happening, the reality is it's not implemented in the ranks. So you use data to figure out where are the gaps and why the gaps occur, and then you do things like you implement initiatives like the Women's Institute and the mentoring program so that we address that. When I left on Monday, I will tell you, mayors, the day I left, I had women, everything from chiefs to inspectors, calling me, crying, saying, we thought that this day would never come. There are so many things that have happened on the job. There's so many communities that I wanted to represent, that I wanted to be the CEO, and I didn't have the opportunity. And now I want to stay longer so that I can do that. So we know these programs work, but we need the data to show us where those gaps are.
Wendy used the word narrative, and I want to thank you, because I wanted to spend maybe the back half of this talking about storytelling, narrative, public perception, and data. And Mayor Jones, I'm going to go to you first on this. Crime is nuance. Public safety is nuance. But the discourse is not nuance. It doesn't account for the complexity of it, or it doesn't account for, as the Mayor Pureval laid out, the spectrum of what happens when people engage with law enforcement. So I want to spend a little bit of time, again, Mayor Jones, I'll go to you first. What opportunity exists for data to help us change the narrative, to bring more nuance, to have a more thoughtful and well-informed conversation? Because this is a very sensitive issue. People have very deep feelings on it. And so I want to know how data can be at the forefront of helping us change that narrative. And then, John, I'll go to you.
Well, we recently wrapped up a study with the Center for Policing Equity, and it told us, a lot of information about our stops and our equity there, but it also told us that 20% of our calls can be answered by someone other than police. So you can develop a new, what we call a civilian service officer category that is not a police officer, to respond to things that police waste a lot of time responding to, and it could be someone, it could be a civilian. So we want to, as we look at public safety overall, we have to get away from police being the first and only response for every single call, because they're not equipped to handle every single call. And so we have to look at our response models and put different types of professionals and civilians in these response models in order to send the right response to the right call.
John, why don't you weigh in?
Yeah, I think that it's an exciting time, because you can't really hide anymore because of the data that's actually becoming available in the particular system. Because when we were in the boardrooms like 20 years ago, you would have these chief marketing officers like just driving decisions off opinions or anecdote. Government too, where you have various different players driving off the loudest voice or some sort of, sexy anecdote. But with the data that comes to the equation and what MasterCard's been able to do in that particular piece, you can no longer hide. You have to look at the data and you have to respond to it. And the data availability allows you to be able to understand what trends are happening and actually be able to take action off of it. and to be able to expose, challenging situations. Because what you'll have is you used to have a lot of data manipulation that was happening in the government, that now I think that is being more and more removed, either through processes or the way in which we collect data, which allows us to get to a single version of the truth so that we can have an equitable solution and serve the citizen population as a whole with the best possible outcomes.
So I want to kind of piggyback on something you were saying, Mayor Jones, about how police are often always the people to go to a call. So I want to have that question in the context of the discussion around rising crime in the country, and how some cities are putting more funding to police agencies, which isn't out of the ordinary. Typically you see rising crime, you see increased budgets, but then when we put evidence to it, when we have studies to it that show that more money does not mean less crime, it doesn't deter crime. And then on top of that, we know tough on crime policies have wreaked havoc on Black and brown communities. So basically, I use that as a frame to say, if we follow the evidence, how should we leverage that data to better inform how we use police? Kind of like what you're saying, when is it police versus another first responder? And how should cities just adjust the way that we approach crime? So Mayor Pureval, I'm gonna ask you to go first, and then Mayor Elorza.
Yeah, I'll give you a very specific example. We are in the work of problem-solving oriented policing, not over policing, not throwing dollars at a problem, but really understanding what is going on in that community and how not just police interventions, but also social workers, other mental health professionals can intervene, frankly, an economy that is equitable and has opportunities for everyone, so folks are reaching for a book or a job rather than a gun. It's obviously very complicated, and law enforcement is just one piece of that. But a specific example that happened here recently in Cincinnati. There are a lot of young people in the summer. These are children who sell water on the side of the street. Apparently it's very profitable. I didn't realize this. I need to start selling water. And so they will run out into a busy intersection and sell water to cars in the intersection. That was creating a public safety hazard for the automobiles, but also for them. So our police responded, and unfortunately, there was a hands-on incident. A lot of social media attention, a lot of very negative attention for the interaction between the kid and the police officer. But instead of having that just be a black eye on our interactions, we thought about, okay, what are these kids trying to do, and how can we empower them to be successful but also safe? And so instead of just a specific police response, we backed off and created an entire youth employment program for them. So we are now spending $2.8 million on year-round youth employment for careers, and not just lifeguards, etc. Lifeguards, by the way, are very important. You can't open community pools without lifeguards, and that is, anyway. So, but we're really focused on careers, and because of this learning for us, we created a third path in our career program for entrepreneurship. And the Water Boys, as we call them, was the first pilot program to do that. And now they're selling water at Bengals games, at UC games, all throughout the city, and making even more money. And they're doing it in a licensed and safe way.
So I want to stay with you, mayors, because, perception in politics is a big part of your world. And data sometimes runs counter to what the public perception and political headwinds are. So I want to hear from all three of you actually on this, and how do you ensure data remains at the center of your decision-making process, and that you try to stay away from letting perception and what people expect get in your way? So Mayor Elorza?
Two things come to mind. The first is, again, coming back to the central role of data inside of our police departments. I think all of us as mayors have highlighted some really cool initiatives that we have going on in our cities. Every mayor has these initiatives. I do wonder how many of these initiatives arose or originated within the police department, as opposed to, say, our policy departments or some other departments. And I really want to focus in on this point is, how well are police departments using data? you know, I've been very invested and involved in our whole recruitment and our training process going through the academy. I speak for Providence, but I think I speak for academies throughout the country. The number of hours dedicated in the police academy to, you know, teaching officers how to use Excel, how to, you know, analyze data and use it, more or less 0%, give or take 1 or 2 points. And you know, these are people that come to this job with a different kind of training. They're great at what they do, and you know, through experience they get even better at, you know, helping to keep us safe. But do they know how to use and analyze data? Those are muscles that they've never fully had to exercise. And so to what extent are we building in not just a culture, but the actual, you know, workforce training and development tools so that these smart data-based initiatives are originating from our police officers? This is going to require a sea change, in my opinion, from where we are today. To your question in terms of perception and reality, you know, it's so tough because sometimes perception becomes its own reality, and we're fighting against that every day. You know, I take a little bit of a counterintuitive view when it comes to transparency in general, but especially with public safety. It's usually thought that you can draw this state line between transparency and trust in the community. I don't know if that's true. You know, you look at cities throughout the country, the level of transparency that we have today compared to 15 years ago is night and day. However, if you look at trust in government, there's probably less trust in government than there has ever been. But particularly with public safety, I think that trust in government really comes not so much from transparency, it comes from those relationships on the ground. That's really what, you know, if those relationships on the ground aren't strong and those interactions aren't positive, then they're not even going to believe the data. So the data is important, but more fundamental, I think, are those relationships. And I come back to this point, in all of our police departments, how well do we measure, you know, what we claim matters? How well do we measure those interactions between police and the community? And, you know, there's this, you know, data and technology, well, technology has this like really awesome power, but I don't think we fully brought it to bear into use in, you know, measuring those intangibles.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the premise of your question suggests that the answer that you want is we ignore perception and focus in on data. And well, I think that would probably be the right answer. That is not the reality, because if your city, you know, I would venture to guess that our crime data in all 3 of our cities has been going down. Our violent crime data may have ticked up during the pandemic, but it's on the way down. But it doesn't matter what the data says. If the public perception of your city is that it is not safe, that it does not feel safe, even if the numbers are going down, and you go out there and say, well, look at the data, it's actually going down, it's actually safe, you appear as if you are completely out of touch, or you are unfeeling or unempathetic. And so our role is more nuanced than just being a cold analysis of the data. There's more art to it than that. And so let me back out the aperture of the frame. The national context around policing and public safety is awful. And yet, the #1 issue, I would venture to guess, in all of our cities is public safety. It's awful because I don't know any mayors in the country who legitimately want to defund the police. And I also don't know any mayors in the country who do not believe their police can be better, or that their police make mistakes. Obviously, it's somewhere in the middle. And what is happening in my police department and the police departments across the country, I mentioned it briefly, is that there is a historic number of retirements going on, and our recruit classes are getting smaller and smaller, putting incredible pressure on our police departments from a personnel perspective. It's harder and harder to recruit people to be police officers right now, which gives us an opportunity for innovation and creativity, which is why we have gone to emergency responders that are unarmed professionals to free up police resources. But it's also an opportunity for our police departments to get more diverse, to get younger, and to lean into technology in a way that they haven't before. But in order to accomplish that, we do need to get our personnel numbers back to where they were, because what we're experiencing in Cincinnati is not necessarily an uptick in violent crime, but we're experiencing an uptick in pedestrian safety issues. Because our police are no longer, do not have the personnel, frankly, to devote significant manpower to traffic violations, which have their own equitable problems, I understand that, but because we've kind of diverted our resources, people are blowing through red lights, they're hitting and killing pedestrians. Our streets, from a traffic perspective, are getting less and less safe, and that is a problem that mayors have to address.
So everything that the mayor said, and I would add that we can't see it as an either-or proposition. We have to see it as both and. So we look at the data and what that's telling us, and we have to look at perception and address both. I think that you have to in this job, because as we talked about earlier, it's more nuanced, right? So the data is telling us that while overall violent crime may be going down, when you have media reports saying, for example, St. Louis is the most dangerous city in the country, but we know that the data is nuanced in that it's only talking about the 300,000 people that make up St. Louis City proper, not the 1.2 million people that make up the region. You know, we have to push back against that narrative with things that people can see and feel. So it's a difficult balancing act, but I think that we're trying to challenge it as best as we can.
So with the remaining time, we only have a few minutes. John, I want to ask you, and then Wendy, I'll also ask you to comment. We've talked about it multiple times in this conversation about how we've just scratched the surface on data. What are our blind spots? What is maybe a data point that that cities should start focusing on as it pertains to policing and equitable outcomes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's nuanced a little, to piggyback off what Mayor Jones says. As you're kind of going through this particular exercise, making sure you're calling out those key segmentations where you may be missing what's actually happening, and to be able to write the narrative, because someone will run with one specific data point and try to cast a story for the whole particular piece. So to be able to call out those nuances, but specifically to your question on where are our blind spots, I think that we have to have an equitable view on data intake and make sure that we're not just over-indexing on one particular area versus another, because sometimes some of the areas within a city where we have very rich data, maybe not the whole population of what's actually happening. So I think you have to remove those biases in terms of your data collection and what's actually happening, because you may have some areas that are over-policed, some areas that are under-policed, and some of the areas that are under-policed actually need to be the areas where we need to be focusing just as much. So being able to look for those outliers and to be able to do that statistical analysis ends up being really key.
Wendy, talk to me about one data element that you, in the next year or two, you hope to be able to incorporate into your evaluation methods.
On the topic of blind spots, I do believe that we have to do some critical work about catching what is going on in the brains of human beings when they're interacting with Black and brown communities, when they're interacting with women. But we have yet to have training programs that work with those who are uniform and both civilian on how do we capture the state in which this person has existed in the past. We train them on crime, we train them on the wall wrap-up, but we never really catch the empathy levels. I would love, in the next 6 months, I'm looking at this right now, I'm exploring it, so it's not final, but we are looking at how do we capture empathy levels by race and gender? How do we take our uniform officers and our civilians and do an assessment on the state of your empathy with women, with African Americans, with Hispanics, with Asian? Because once we have a sense of where you started, we don't want to cancel you. We don't want to say, well, you have a low empathy level for Latina women. No, I don't want to cancel you, but I'm going to treat it as an intelligence gap. The same way I treat you can't run 5 more miles as a physical gap before you pass your test. So we are looking and exploring right now, for those of you who do virtual reality training, how do we use virtual reality to incorporate that in our training? How do we partner with universities who do diversity and equity work based on how people view unconscious biases? And then how do we do that assessment at the end to see as you come up the ranks, are we getting better at empathy? Are we doing better by race and gender? So that if we place a commanding officer who is, let's say, in the Chinatown community and they're dealing with Asians, or they're in Washington Heights, that's where I'm from, big up to Washington Heights, or Dominicans, that they understand what is happening with the dominoes of the young men who are playing outside. And those are cultural competencies that I would love to see software move towards.
Well, I'm sorry to say, but we have to wrap up our conversation. Give a hand for our panel. Thank you all for having this conversation with me. It was a pleasure.